Good. Okay. So there, surely Julie is magical in many forms or another. I won't tell you. At 5 to 1 at Toronto time, the power went out, so everything decided to unhinge. But thank goodness the wheels came back on, and we do have power. And I'm going to say, here we are, Friday afternoon at the Manor. My name is Joseph Mastandrea, and it's a delight to have Julie here. But we're going to bring the mic over to Susan Johnson, who will welcome Juli Malone to our wonderful podium Friday afternoon at the Manor.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. Glad you could make it. We're honored to welcome Juli Malone, as JJ said, who is going to tell us about the Celtic festival of Samhain, and I can't wait to hear about it. So Julie, please.
Thank you very much, Susan, and that was beautifully pronounced. And John, thank you for the invitation. So as stated, my name is Julie, and I live in the southwest of Ireland, and I have lived here all my life, and as have my forefathers. And the Celtic Festival of Samhain starts in All Hallows Eve. So it's the 31st of October. And we have 8 fire festivals on our Celtic Wheel of the Year. And Samhain is our Celtic New Year. So on all our feast days on the Celtic Wheel of the Year, we have the 2 solstices, we have the 2 equinoxes, which are the points of balance. Then we have Samhain, which would be known as Halloween, and that is the festival of death and rebirth. And then we go on to St. Bridget's Day, which is beginning of spring. And then we have Bealtaine, which is the beginning of summer, and Lunasa, which is the beginning of Harvest Festival, which is August.
Yeah. I want to be on mute. Mute.
Sorry about that.
Going...
That's Gary. He wants to figure out mute. Okay, I can help him along.
Okay. So Samhain is a really sacred festival in Ireland. And I think when it comes to all the festivals, at the point of the festival, I always say, this is my favorite festival. And when I am at that point of the year, it really is. And I think what that signifies to me is just that every festival has a very different energy. And at that time of the year, it seems like the most sacred of them. But there's something very special in Samhain insofar as it's also our Festival of the Dead. So Samhain, Samhain, is also the name in Irish of the whole month of November. And in Irish, we call it Ní na Marav, which is the month of the dead. And in our tradition, and as a child growing up in Dingle, I know you get to celebrate Halloween, but we didn't really see it as Halloween. We saw it as Samhain, and Halloween has come from the Irish Festival of the Dead of Samhain. So as children, it was very much gathering around at home. So we didn't go trick-or-treating, we didn't go to other people's houses, but we did dress up. The Irish name for spirits would be Pookie. So we dressed up as Pookie. And what we did, usually it consisted almost exclusively of pillow slips, and we would do the 2 eyes and the mouth, and sheets and old clothes, and we would dress up basically as spirits and try and frighten each other, run around the house, go visit the graveyard, and then we use turnips. So turnips are Swedes, which are very different to pumpkins, because they're very hard to carve. So we'd be carving and spoons and knives and forks and bending spoons. And there was 5 children in our house, so we might have like 5 or 10 pumpkins. And then we would make all the of the turnips, we make all scary faces, and we would put them on the windows. And they were really to scare away any malevolent spirits or any spirits that may come unwelcomely into our house. And then there was also, we would do nice turnips, and they were to welcome the good spirits in on the night. So we would sit around, we would have dinner, we would leave an empty chair, we would leave an empty plate, so that when the spirits came to our home, they knew, because this was our sacred festival of the dead, that they knew that we welcomed them, that there was always a place for the ancestors to come back, always a place at our table. And we played a lot of games, and to me and to us at the time, they were just simple games, but retrospectively they were all divination games. So we used to make this bread, and we call it the boring brack. So it's known as the barn brack, and in it we get pieces of brown greasewood paper, and we put a ring, and we put a pea and a stick and a penny and a rag. So there was great excitement. The ring was like the most prized possession, and if you got the ring, it foretold that you were married. And if you got the pea, it foretold that you would never marry. That was a complete devastation when you're 6 years old. And then if you got the rag, it meant that you had poverty ahead of you. And if you got the stick, it meant your spouse was going to beat you, or you were going to have a life of real hardship. So there was great excitement and great, I suppose, like fighting over the barn brack and who's to get the next slice. So my mother and father would have to really, guard it as to who was to get the greatest slice, because we always wanted the ring. But they were all divination games. So we used to play bopping apple and snap apple, and there was other games that foretold who was going to die first. But it was always about our ancestors, because we truly believed, and these were the rituals that we had, and it was normal to us. But retrospectively, they were very much, rituals for the dead. We would leave some food outside the door as an offering to the spirit world and the nature world. And we would sit around dinner, and I know Mom and Dad used to say, well, who died now since last year? And there'd be big discussions as to who died. And then we would speak of them, and we would remember my grandparents and aunties or uncles or whoever had died. So we would start with who died within the previous 12 months, and then we would move on to the outer spectrum. And I suppose, when we always fear that when we die, we'll be forgotten and nobody will remember us. But on All Hallows Night and Ia Hauna, we remembered everybody. And it's not as ritualistic as writing it down, even though I know because we all grew up Catholic in Ireland, and we would have the November list of the dead. So you would write down all the people that you needed to be remembered, and you would bring it to the church, and then that would be included in the book for the dead for November. But I loved that ceremony, and I still do it at home on Iha Hauna, on personally speaking of each one that died and remembering them, and remember the good and the witty things of them. So we also see it as the place of going from summer to winter. So it's entering the darkest part of the year. So from Samhain, 6 weeks later, we have winter solstice, which is the shortest day of the year and the darkest point of the year. So for those 6 weeks, and then 6 weeks after that would be Lolly Bridget, St. Bridget's Day, and 6 weeks after that would be the spring equinox. So every 6 weeks we have our festival. But there are also pauses in working with the agricultural year. So there are pauses of all the work is done. This is our big harvest festival. Our tubbies are full, our larders are full. Any cattle that weren't going to be carried over for the winter were slaughtered between Samhain and the 11th of November, which was St. Martin's Day. So that's when any cattle we weren't going to carry over, all debts were to be paid by the St. Martin's Day. So it was a time when we had the last sheaf was cut from the ground. So anything to be harvested outside from the fields would be done by now. And anything after that would be left to the chailak, to the crone. To, you know, we don't have a history of witches in Ireland. What we had is one of our deities was the chailak, the crone, the hag. And anything left in the field after Samhain was left to the hag. So all good was brought in before that. And it was a time of going into deep dreaming. It was a time of coming home to self. And Iha Hauna was very much a liminal space of movement between the spirit worlds, that they could come visit us and we could go and visit them in this traveling, that there wasn't any time. This was a space where it was all as one. And when we dressed up as Pookie, as spirits, if someone came to the door, you would offer them soul food and you would welcome them in. And of course, if you're very welcoming and you know, good fortune would be bestow you. And if you weren't so welcoming, obviously, the opposite of good fortune would be bestow you. And it was also a time of trickery, you know, because when you're masked, I suppose the funny thing about when you're masked, and we had our pillowcases or our old clothes, and you know, there was no face paints or anything like that. It was you know, just maybe soot would be used, maybe, or around the eyes. And I suppose every day when, you know, it's like me coming talking to you tonight, I put my face on, put my lipstick on, put my game face on. All of you are here in your own game face way. So here we are in you know, in ordinary life, yet how we react to in different places, how you at home, or if you were in a court of law, or if you were in church, or if you were shopping, you know, there's different appropriate behavior. Whereas when you're wearing a mask, you can be at your truest. It's funny, you know, without the mask, we're masking all the time. But in Iha Hauna, there's a freedom to be who you are because you're sheltered behind this mask. So I suppose, you know, I know, like perhaps people opening gates or throwing eggs, or, you know, there was a certain freedom on that night to maybe do a little trickery on someone that you had to suffer for the rest of the year. And there's a certain cleansing in that. We always, I lived just across the road from a graveyard, so we always went to the graveyard on Iahauna, and it was always very exciting to go to the graveyard. And we went inside the gates and we said our prayers, and then we used to run around the graveyard and go all the way up, around and down. And it always seemed like a really exciting thing to do, except that when you got to the very top, there was always a moment maybe where it was like, oh, I don't know, this is such a good idea. And we would just terrify ourselves. But again, we were constantly looking out and waiting for communication with the other side. And that threshold time, very much a threshold time, the summer winter threshold time. And in Ireland, you know, we have the fairies, Nadina Maha, that's the Irish for the good people. And it's not like Hollywood, you know, when we say fairies or the she, we're talking about people like us, but they're much smaller, and they're from the old gods, the Tuatha, the she. They're in the mounds, they're in the mountains, they're in the stones. They're the stone people, the standing people. They're in the other world. And the hawthorn tree was our portal to the other world. And it was very sacred. The hawthorn tree is very sacred. And the hawthorn tree is part of the rose family. And it would be very much used for grieving or for anything to do with the heart, strengthening the heart, for blood pressure, for the cardiovascular system, on an emotional level for grief. And the hawthorn tree in Irish is called the scac gal, which is the bright bush. And in May, which is 6 months after Samhain, and that's the threshold of leaving spring into summer, into the really bright part of the year, the flowers of the hawthorn become the May blossom, and they're quite intoxicating in a most beautiful way, the smell of the hawthorn. But at this time of the year, we're talking about the haws of the hawthorn. So that would be a very sacred tree in Ireland, and you daren't cut it. And a lone hawthorn was it was a very lucky thing to have on your farm or on your land, but you daren't damage it, or you'd always ask permission before you harvested from it. So we would always say the she or the little people. So when I talk about fairies in Ireland, we're not talking about wings or anything like that. Really, we're talking about this other world that in Ireland, it's normal for us. We seem to be appeasing them all the time, you know, leaving milk and honey out for them, and, you know, going to holy wells and blessing them, and asking for blessings from them. And this is normal. You know, roads have been diverted in Ireland because they couldn't cut down a hawthorn tree. A big dual carriageway had to be diverted. So 3 or 4 years of engineering work and plans had to be diverted because the local people wouldn't allow them to cut the hawthorn tree down, because they felt it would bring bad luck to those that travelled in the world. So it's a real, the harvest is in, we're moving into winter. And it was also seen that the fairies are moving from their summer residence to their winter residence. So there's the spirits, and then there's this other world of beings. And we had to be very careful. And when we talk about the other world, it brings into question ourselves, our own mortality. And where are we with this? And how will we die? And when will we die? And who will we die with? And who will be present? And, you know, these deeper questions of death. And even as children, you know, the games, death came into it, and it made it very present, but it also made it very normal. You know, so in Ireland, when somebody dies and the body is brought home, and I think my first memory of death was when I was 7. My grandmother was dying, and we were in the house with her, and we were having cups of tea, and I wasn't having cups of tea, I was 7, but all the adults were. But I do remember being inside in the bedroom and her drawing her last breaths, and all the people around me, the adults, obviously they were taller, so I was smaller. But it was very normal, and saying say goodbye to Nana. And the bodies are kept in the house. It's normal to touch them, to kiss them, to be present with them, to play music with them, to celebrate their life, to be very conscious of their journey from their clay body to the other world. And especially in Ihauna on All Hallows Eve, we really, I suppose we would light big bonfires. And fire is very transformational. Fire is very transformative element. And you know, we turn off all the lights and just have candles, and we'd have the fire outside. And it all comes back to the agricultural year, where we would look on, you know, how kind that the sun has been to us in all our harvest is in. But now we must get through the winter. Now we must get through the deep dreaming. Now we must move through. It's like going into the womb. So all in nature is letting go. The fall is there. It's a very beautiful transition. The fall in nature and all the colors of the trees, and they just let go. It's like an exhale. And that calls for us to exhale as well. It calls for us to relax. It calls for us to come fireside. It calls for us to gather closer as a family and to be. And I think when you turn off all the lights and when you just light a candle or you sit by fireside, it changes everything. It changes how we communicate with each other. It changes how we see each other. There's a lot more shadows and light when you're fireside, and things are not as, we're not stuck in the we're not stuck in the, I suppose, the enemy of clarity, where things are fixed. By a fire, things are a lot more gray, and you're more open and more expansive. So we would. And the Irish of a bonfire is the tithe, a tinna knova. Tinna is a fire and knov is bones. And so in this bonfire, and we would let go in the bonfire. We would send our wishes to spirit in the bonfire. We would call to our ancestors through the fire. We would send blessings to them through the fire. And we would have that space, that liminal space would feel very real in the rituals by the fire. And of course, it's harvest time, so it's a beautiful time of abundance, and with that time of abundance comes gratitude. We're so grateful that the grain is in. We're so grateful that the animals have been fed. We're so grateful that we have food to carry over. We're so grateful for our health, for our being, for our families. And there's also, I suppose, that time in winter where families are gathered closer. And families are complicated. They're very complicated. It's not so simple. So, in the summertime, we're out and about. It's all about being outward. Whereas in wintertime, you have to come inwards. So you're also, you're more aware of your inner landscape and working on your inner landscape. And you're in closer proximity to your family or your community. And we have a word in Ireland called Bahan Tiath. So Bahan Tiath was when people went from one house to the other. This is pre-television or pre-digital. And they would play fiddle by the fire, or they would play cards, they would sing, they would tell stories. A shanachie is the Irish word for a storyteller. And this was normal. So wintertime was a great time, and Ihahauna, Halloween night, All Hallows night, was the beginning of that, the beginning of that period of darkness where all the work was done in the fields, and their survival, was dependent on the few hours of daylight where they just had to bring firewood in and water and do whatever they needed to do to tend to the land. But for the most part, the work was done. So there was a lot of creativity, a lot of music, a lot of dance, and a lot of celebration. And time just to be, and time to communicate. And when we're working, or when we have non-verbal communication with music and with movement and with stories, that links us again back to our ancestors. It links us back to speaking of the dead, remembering them. And a lot of these stories and a lot of the dances and the music are generational. They were handed down from generation to generation in Irish music and in Irish dance. So again, everything was linked back in our culture, in our language, in our music, in our movement to our ancestors and to the present day. So when the Irish then left and went to America, they must have been delighted because they found pumpkins. They didn't have to carve turnips and, have forks bending and spoons bending, trying to dig them out. They found pumpkins and then they just slit the top and then off they went and they made their jack-o'-lanterns. And jack-o'-lantern obviously was the story of the guy Jack that made a pact with the devil. And they call cards, the devil's prayer book. So he was playing cards with the devil, and he was given a pack of cards called the devil's prayer book, and from there on he won with his deck of cards. And the pact was that the devil wouldn't take his soul. But when Jack died, he couldn't get into heaven and he couldn't get into hell. And he was given a coal to light his lantern. And there he travelled between the worlds forevermore. Neither in heaven nor hell, he travelled with his lantern. So when the Irish went to America and they had their pumpkins, and I don't know, things went a bit crazy and trick-or-treats happened and Hollywood kicked in and they started wearing fairy dresses and I don't know, Scream and Halloween 1 and Halloween 2 happened and films happened and Hollywood happened and I don't know, candy happened and and the boring brack was out the door and the snap apples were out the door and the dead were out the door and everything was out the door except zombies. So that is, children see it through a very different eyes now. They see it through pumpkins and they see it through zombies and Descendants 2 and all the other movies that are gathered around Halloween. But for us, it's always the sacredness of gathering and honoring our dead, our ancestors, and taking time also into our own death. And I think this is a really important thing, that we speak of death and speak of death to our family and to our friends. And when we do it, it's not that it draws it towards us, but it cuts the fears, in speaking of it and being very present in wakes and very present in funerals. I think it takes away lots of layers of fear that otherwise they're there and they're just shoved in a corner and we won't speak of them. But the day will come, that transition, that journey, that traveling into the great mystery. And Halloween is a wonderful time to speak and to introduce and to speak out loud, your connection with death. And I think in doing that, it makes life more precious. My feeling is that, when I wake up in the morning and when I work with people that are dying, or work with the families of people that are dying and helping them to transition and letting go. We can't stop the death. We can't stop it. We can't run from it, and we can't stop it. But when we're really conscious with those that are dying, and when we give them permission to die, it's such a beautiful, potent energy. And I love that the last breath is another breath into another world. You know, it's the exhale, is the inhale. I always think of it as like going underwater. Just, you know, hold your breath and then you come up and you exhale in inhale in the next world. And they're very close to us. And at Ihauna, there's that feeling of them just being present and being conscious to that and that connection. Do you want to ask me anything, John?
Aye.
It was amazing.
One second.
just
I'm
conscious.
just going to move you into what happened there. Ooh. I did a funny thing and I made you in the middle. I'm not sure what I did there. Okay.
Okay.
I'm trying to, oh, here we are, gallery. It's good. Now we got everybody in gallery. Oh, yes, a few questions, definitely. You mentioned a couple of things, and I'm just thinking out loud. You mentioned brack bread. Now, is that like a tea, the bread that's made with tea?
No, it's not. There's two. There's a tea brack,
Right.
and then there's the boring brack, which is the barn brack. The barn brack is like a bread, but loads of currants and loads of raisins. But
Okay.
my mother was forever on the scout looking for a moist tea brack. She was obsessed
Right.
with this. And every Halloween, we used to have another version of the moist tea brack that
Right.
had different degrees of success and unsuccess.
So I'm
But
going to
the
ask.
barn brack,
Okay.
Mhm.
I was going to ask if anyone else wants to make a question. So did Gerald or Susan want to ask a question?
Yeah, I'd like to. I mean, it's interesting how all these, I mean, a lot of it comes from the Catholic, the Day of the Dead is always around November 1st, whereas
Yes.
in Japan, the Buddhist festival of Obon is in the summertime, in August. And that's the time when people travel back to their hometown to, you know, again, communicate with their family that's passed on before and that. So it's an interesting thing that how every culture seems to have its own version of this.
in the Celtic tradition, the Irish tradition, any festival starts in the darkness. So it
Mhm.
always starts on the eve, the night before. So, and that's why our Celtic New Year is in Halloween, because it's like in the womb. So
Mhm.
life starts in the womb, and then there's the birthing and the moving forward and the manifestation. So that's why it's on sundown that it starts.
Right.
Thank you. And I think Gary Coates had a question.
Yeah, my background is Irish. My great-grandmother came from Belfast, and my
Okay.
father's father came from Belfast. 2 years ago, my partner and I went to Ireland, and we were in Dublin, and we went down to Gorey, and we stayed at a seaside village just outside of Gorey on the sea.
Lovely.
It was fabulous.
Yeah.
I just don't understand the stories that you've told me. The only one that I heard before was the turnip being carved for the festival. And I couldn't figure out how they ever carved a turnip, but now I
With great
understand.
difficulty.
Yes,
With great
bent
difficulty.
spoons, bent forks.
Many bent spoons, bent
Yeah.
forks, knives flying,
Oh
fighting
my
over
goodness.
a spoon, fighting over the best spoon that didn't bend.
Uh-huh. Well, I do know
Yeah,
there
so
was
that's
another one, New Year's Eve here, which is our New Year's Eve. The darkest person in the house was sent outside and to come in first to bring good luck. Does that have any
okay.
resonance with you? Yeah, I don't, and I was always
No.
sent out because I was the darkest one in
Okay.
the family.
Yeah.
But
Is
it's
that the darkest hair?
yeah, I was dark, very dark hair. Apparently, what did they call them? The Black Irish or something. I don't know what it is. A lot of tales. But the episode of you with your Nana, I was the same. I was 9 years old, getting ready to go to school, and my mom was keeping her mother at our house. This is the days before nursing homes,
Yes.
etc. And she'd had heart failure. And one morning, my mom called me, bring in a glass of cold water for Graham. So just as I went in, my mom had my Graham sitting up and she was holding her at the back. And just as I come in with the glass of water, that was it. My grandmother just fell back. So when I come home for lunch, of course, I was told that Graham had passed away. And that was my first episode with death, 9 years old. And then I had 3 women in my life who I was with when they passed away. The first was my gran, the second was my mother-in-law at the hospital. And the last, of course, was my late wife. And the ironic thing about the passing of my wife, I was sitting beside her and she was in the bed in the hospital. And it was the doctor that told me, Eva's no longer with us. And I couldn't believe it. I thought, well, I'm sure she's still sleeping. Of course, you try and rationalize, but very peaceful. So all, with the exception of my mother-in-law, the deaths were very peaceful. The horrible thing about the death of my mother-in-law, she had heart problems. We got her to the hospital, to emergency, and they attempted to insert an external pacemaker. And we were there when they were doing it. It was a horrible situation. And after she had passed away, the doctor came to us and said, well, we tried to do everything. I said, why didn't you just let her go? It was just horrible. However, that's all part of life.
I'm sorry to hear that, Gary, you know, and death is, as has birth, both have become very medicalized, except that a lot of the medical institutions unfortunately view death as a failure. And you know, she lost her life to cancer, you know, or it's almost like the terms are in like a failure, or if the person had done something wrong. So it sounds like you have been a great companion to be with in the death process, because it sounds like they all took their breath into the next life in very peacefully.
Oh yes, yeah. Well, I turned 80 this year, and like everybody else who's 80, there's certain health issues. So I tell everybody I'm playing the waiting game now. So they look at me and I said, what's that? I said, I'm waiting to die. Is there anything wrong with that? We're all going to go.
My uncle, as he got older, he towards the end, he'd say, I'm actually in the waiting room now. They're going to see me next. I'm in the waiting room.
Yeah, well, that's great. I enjoyed your I can't say stories, your history of Ireland. And the one thing I wanted to ask, where did the fairy phenomena come from? How was it started? Is there any logical explanation to this? Is it folk tale or? It's
folk tale. So, you know, we have the Tuatha Dé Danann, which are like a mythical race in Ireland. And there was the Fomorians, and, you know, the Miletians came and fought them. And then through all the wars, it was decided that we would live above ground and they would move underground. So they are our fairy folk. They live underground. So it's a bit like I talking about Samhain and how it's our sacred festival of the dead, and then there's this mad occasion of Halloween that, you know, is more Hollywood. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, Hollywood is so, like, you know, Halloween is so far from the sacred sound. So our fairies are our mythical deities in Ireland, and what we call the good folk, the wee folk, the good people, they're very much the old gods to us. They're very much the old gods. And Ireland is it's a very magical place, and the land is very magical, and that's what I work with. I work with the land all the time. So I work as a Dingle Druid. So it's with the land and with the plants and with the trees and with the agricultural year. It's what I work with. It's who I am. I grew up a farmer's daughter, so I just see the world through that prism. I see the world in working with nature and working in the agricultural year. But Ireland is covered with fairy mounds, stone circles. It's just everywhere. There's sacred sites everywhere, and it's in the land. It's a very tangible thing, the sacredness of the land here. And
Julie, can you say
even-
more about the hawthorn bushes? And because I remember when we were in
yes,
Carlingford, there was we always looked out for the fairy rings, meaning that sometimes it'd be a circle of bushes, and they said you should never cross into it unless you ask permission.
yeah. So the hawthorn is it's in the genus of the rose family,
Right.
and it's a really good remedy. So herbalists use it all the time for your
Right.
heart. So physically, it's very good for your heart, blood pressure, any balancing at the heart on a physical level. On an emotional level, it's really good for grief or any emotional upset. And when I say grief, grief is the loss of many things. So it's the loss of many things. Because sometimes people just say, think of it in terms of a loved one. But we're constantly grieving and shedding every day over many things. But the hawthorn is just sacred. It is sacred. I was mentioning earlier that there was 3 or 4 or 5 years of engineering in County Clare in building a dual carriageway. And when they came to physically build the dual carriageway, the local people gathered around and said, "You're not going to cut down that hawthorn tree. You're not cutting it down." So you have all these people in their hard hats, you've got you've got all the logical team going, "Listen, we're driving a road through here and that's it. We're 4 or 5 years down the plans, we've got the money." It's a big thing doing a highway or a motorway. And no, they said no. If that lone hawthorn tree is cut down, because we view it as very sacred, you don't touch it.
Right.
And it is a portal to the other world. It is the portal to the She. It is a portal to the Dina Maha, to the good people, to the fairies. So, to the old gods. So you do not cut it. So people power worked and they had to divert the road. They had to go, and all the engineers and all the work, they had to go make another plan and divert it around this hawthorn tree. So that is how sacred. And it's a funny thing in Ireland, because even, people say, "Oh, sure, I don't believe in any of that rubbish. I don't believe in any of that rubbish." And then if you ask them to cut down a hawthorn tree, they say, "Not at all, are you mad?" I'm like, "Why? But you don't believe in that rubbish." "But you'd be mad to want to do it."
Love it. I love it.
So even those that claim not to believe in it still wouldn't touch it for
Yep.
fear of. And it's just in our bones.
Yes.
It's of us, It's very difficult to describe that. And Gary, you've been to Ireland, and John, you've been to Ireland.
It's an of course, not a debate, right?
Sorry?
It's an of course, not a debate. Right.
But yes, it is how it is. And we've all grown up with that sacredness. But the oak tree is sacred to us, and it's very much about strength. And the blackthorn is sacred. All the plants, the holly is sacred. Blackthorn is what we make the shillelaghs and the blackthorn stick from.
Okay.
And but the elder and the hawthorn, they're the two that we have to be very, very careful with.
Right.
I'm talking about, in I suppose people would be very wary of the hawthorn, and there would be a lot of folklore beliefs around the hawthorn. And the folklore beliefs would be, leave it alone, don't touch it. It's, it's not of this world, it's belonging to the other world. So we don't touch it.
What
And
part of the
reverence,
what part of the hawthorn is used for the heart and blood pressure?
The haws are used and the flowers are used. So I make a hawthorn brandy every year, And so you just pick your haws and you wash them, you bring them in, you put them in a bottle or a Kilner jar, put maybe a spoon of sugar in, fill it with brandy, and then give it a little shake every day for a couple of months. And then you open it up, strain it off, and then I would use that in a little dropper bottle. So when I say hawthorn brandy now, it's not something you sit down and you start, kicking into a bottle of hawthorn brandy. You use this in medicinal. It's a medicine. So even a little dropper bottle, and if you're having a glass of water, you can put a couple of drops in, and it just eases the heart. So the other way people take a rescue remedy. So I would use a hawthorn brandy like a remedy like that. And if somebody got a shock or if someone was in grief, I would, I have tiny little crystal glasses, and then I would pour them a small glass and ask them to sip it, and it would warm the heart, it would ease the heart, and it would just settle the person down. So is it the brandies, the hawthorn? Who knows?
Are any of these available in the health food stores?
You can buy haws. You can pick haws at the moment, and you can buy them dried, and you could make your own brandy. They can be sold as tinctures. So tincture is the word that we use in making a tincture. I call them spirit medicine. So I would have tinctures of all kinds. And I suppose that's, alcohol was made from plants, so I would have a rose and a mint vodka that I would do during the summer, and it's really nice as an aperitif. It helps to settle. And the mint, the sloes, which is the blackthorn, that is something, those thorns, you have to be very careful when you're picking sloes, because you can get sepsis from the thorns. And all plants and trees that have thorns, they're very protective, but they also give us that quality of protection. And it's like in the cherry family. So the sloe gin is made, and it's really delicious, but it's very uplifting. It's very brings a lot of light, whereas the hawthorn brandy, really settles you. And we say that the sloe berries and the blackthorn, it pierces through with these very thorns, these very vicious thorns, or protective thorns. It can pierce through that which we cannot pierce through ourselves. So people had all kinds of concoctions in their houses. So when somebody came to visit, if you're feeling down, they might give you some of the blackthorn gin, and if you were grieving, they give you a little bit of hawthorn, and it was very normal. These are very normal, and I find that they're very potent. So you drink a tiny amount, and you get a huge relief from the plants. But it's different to going in and buying something.
Thank you, Julie. This has been so amazing. And so we can't wait to share this with other people, and probably we'll look forward to having you again in the springtime. And we're looking forward to, one day again, returning to Ireland, and definitely. So thank you. So Susan, if you want to we'll pass our microphone over to Susan.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. This was really incredible. You can also catch us on YouTube and on our webpage, manorroadunited.com, I think. And coming up next week, we have Marlena Smith, who's the theatre producer, who was there when the musical Cats was brought to Toronto. I don't know if any of you remember, but they were restoring the Elgin and Winter Garden Theatre for it. So this sounds like it's going to be amazing. We hope you can make it.
Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Thank you.
It was really, really fascinating. So interesting.